Hello everyone. This video will focus on just the first 7 paragraphs of Michel Foucault's What is an Author, an essay that enjoys classic status within the canons of literary theory and may be the single most taught piece of writing by this major thinker, at least at the undergraduate level. Despite his title, Foucault is not interested in what kinds of people become writers, let alone the biographical details of the lives of individual authors. Instead, his central arguments concern the ways in which the concept of authorship can be mobilized to underwrite, sanction, or limit the circulation and interpretation of texts. His ideas have quite far-reaching consequences for the critical enterprise, which is probably one reason why this essay is considered so important. But Foucault takes a little while to make clear what his central arguments will be. In fact, I think his first few pages are quite off-putting for the first-time reader. That's because we are dropped into the middle of an ongoing intellectual conversation about very complicated things, and Foucault makes no concession to the fact that we might not be fully aware of the details of this prior conversation. Things are further complicated by the fact that this conversation has an unspoken subtext, Foucault's intellectual rivalry with 2 other French intellectuals of the period, Jacques Derrida and Roland Barthes. Although Foucault disdains to name or cite either Derrida or Barthes directly, his essay makes reference to ideas associated with both these thinkers, and will subject them to critique. In his first 2 paragraphs, however, Foucault presents this essay somewhat modestly as an act of self-correction, a return to certain aspects of my work which now appear ill-advised. Apparently, in his previous book, The Order of Things, he allowed certain authors' names to function ambiguously, and this has left him vulnerable to objections, which he now proposes to address. With the 3rd paragraph, however, his tone becomes more defensive. He suggests that certain of these objections, such as, for example, the claim that he failed to understand the totality of Marx, miss the point, since he was really trying to do something else. What, then, was he trying to do in his last project? In his 4th paragraph, he tells us that the goal of both The Order of Things and also his forthcoming book, which would be called The Archaeology of Knowledge, is to situate comprehensive discursive units such as natural history or political economy, and to establish the methods and instruments for delimiting, analyzing, and describing these unities. To which you might reasonably ask, what the hell does that mean? I think it helps to frame this as an essentially epistemological project, epistemology being a genuinely useful 6-syllable word. It comes from the Greek term episteme, meaning knowledge or understanding, and so refers to the study of knowledge. Epistemology is less concerned with the content of specific disciplines, whether literary studies or sociology or physics, but with the processes whereby ideas within those disciplines are constituted as knowledge. An epistemologist asks how it is that an idea can graduate from being a mere opinion or unverified theory to something that is treated as a fact or baseline within some larger discourse. Foucault was interested in the processes whereby different academic disciplines or regimes of knowledge constituted themselves as such, how we decide what falls under the purview of one discipline and what falls out, or why something might count as knowledge within the study of physics, for example, but not within the study of biology or literature or the law. Or indeed, why something might count as knowledge within a single discipline at one time and not at another. One of Foucault's main points in The Order of Things is that knowledge is never just a simple accretion of facts, but shaped by historical and social forces, or, to put it in theory speak, that our ideas about what makes something knowledge are historically and culturally contingent. Foucault believed that we should try and think ourselves into unfamiliar perspectives if we want to understand how knowledge was constituted by other people at other times. Having recognized the importance of what we might call epistemic situatedness for whole fields of knowledge production, such as natural history, he now realizes that, as a privileged moment of individualization in the history of ideas, knowledge, and literature, or in the history of philosophy and science, the question of the author demands a more direct response. In other words, if we really want to understand how different forms of knowledge are legitimated, we might even say how different forms of knowledge are authorized as knowledge, then we must understand the concept of the author a little better. We're only coming to the end of the 4th paragraph, but let's sum up so far. Foucault has said that his larger project is to situate comprehensive discursive units such as natural history or political economy, and to establish the methods and instruments for delimiting, analyzing, and describing these unities. I have translated this as follows. Foucault wants to understand better the ways in which intellectual disciplines, comprehensive discursive units, constitute themselves as disciplines. And to that end, he wants to uncover the various rules and procedures, the methods and instruments, whereby it is decided what counts as knowledge within those disciplines. Furthermore, Foucault has come to believe that in order to do this work, he needs to rethink the concept of the author. The question of the author demands a more direct response. Slightly surprisingly, he then says he will set aside the socio-historical analysis of this concept, any examination of the conditions that fostered the formulation of the idea of the author, and instead focus on the singular relationship that holds between an author and a text, the manner in which a text apparently points to this figure who is outside and precedes it. Now, the important thing here is the phrasing. Notice how it reverses what we might think of as the more commonsensical notion, which is that authors come before texts. Foucault suggests that the singular relationship between author and text actually might be the reverse. The text gives rise or points to the figure of the author. So, what's going to be important for Foucault is not the obvious idea that authors write texts, but the more complex notion that texts call into being and substantiate our notions of authorship. And indeed, as he will say later, that different kinds of text substantiate different notions of authorship. He will clarify the implications of this idea in the 3rd section of the essay, but again, he doesn't immediately elaborate on this point, instead taking a modernist detour by invoking Samuel Beckett's famous question, famous if you read Irish modernist literature anyway, what matter who's speaking? The next 2 paragraphs, the 6th and 7th in the essay, are among the most difficult, not because they contain the most important ideas, fortunately, but simply because Foucault now starts to work in shorthand, gesturing towards larger ideas, debates, and assumptions, none of which would be obvious or self-evident to a lay reader, and all of which Foucault takes for granted. Let's do our best to translate this intellectual shorthand. As I've noted, he begins the 6th paragraph by quoting a famous line from the modernist author Samuel Beckett, "What matter who's speaking?" Foucault suggests that Beckett's statement has been elevated to a fundamental principle in contemporary writing. Now, by contemporary writing, he actually seems to mean a rather small coterie of high modernist authors and post-structuralist theorists, Jacques Derrida and his followers chief among them, but we can let that go. For this coterie, among whom Foucault seems to include himself, the personal identity of a given author really doesn't matter, at least at one level. That's because the members of this coterie take seriously the idea that language is essentially exterior to the self, something that we learn from the outside rather than something that rises naturally from within, or not restricted to the confines of interiority, as he says here. This larger system of language also precedes any individual act of communication. Foucault sees this conception of language as a reversal of older notions of writing, romantic notions, although he does not use that term, which emphasized an understanding of writing as a form of personal expression. Notice his contemptuous scare quotes around this word. This reversal from that romantic position, he says, transforms writing into an interplay of signs, regulated less by the content it signifies than by the very nature of the signifier. Now, this kind of sentence would become very common in theoretical essays written in the 1980s. Indeed, nowadays it's the rhetorical equivalent of one of those hideous 1980s jackets with too many zippers. The basic insight it expresses, however, derives from the work of Jacques Derrida, whose theoretical engagement with Saussurean linguistics popularized this oracular way of speaking about signs and signifiers. and those of you who want to go to the source might even risk the first chapter of Derrida's almost unreadable book of Grammatology. But the essentially Derridian point that Foucault is making is more or less simply just this. Whatever message we might hope to convey through an act of writing, the content it signifies, we aren't finally in control of how it is received. Instead, that process is regulated by the very nature of the signifier. That is, it is dependent on an arbitrary system of previously agreed upon signs, a system that pre-exists and so, to some extent, predetermines our own use of those signs. Now, older, author-centered ways of thinking propose a relatively simple and hierarchical structure of meaning and interpretation. But Derrida's emphasis on language as a larger system that regulates and overdetermines individual acts of writing decenters the author, to use another theory word. That is to say, the author is displaced as the central figure in the system of meaning and reduced to being just one point or node in a larger system of communication. This is what Foucault is getting at when he says in the final 2 sentences of the 6th paragraph that the essential basis of this contemporary writing is not the exalted emotions related to the act of composition or the insertion of the subject into language. Rather, it is primarily concerned with creating an opening where the writing subject endlessly disappears. Foucault is, I think, overstating his case for rhetorical purposes, perhaps because he wants to upset any romantic poets who might be listening. But his basic point, again, is that while it used to be fashionable to think of great literature as an emotionally inspired act of composition, or the assertion of creative individuality, it's now more fashionable to think of literature as a larger system that no one person can create or control, and into which the individual writer or writing subject disappears. A bit like an ugly 1980s jacket, in other words, that looks like it might make a contribution to your personal style, but actually ends up subsuming the identity of the wearer, displacing them into the play of arbitrary zippers. We might ask why Foucault feels the need to even name Beckett if he really thinks that the writing subject is doomed to disappear into the opening created by writing itself, but we'll let that go for now too. The point I want to emphasize is that Foucault's tone here is not that of an acolyte, simply repeating what Derrida has taught him. It's a bit more sardonic than that, a kind of course, thanks to my friend Jacques, who I'm not even going to name, we all now know that writing is regulated by the nature of the signifier. The implication of this tone being that actually maybe those cool jackets, concepts that Jacques the Zipper has sold to everyone, aren't actually that cool after all. The 7th paragraph basically does with Roland Barthes what the prior paragraph did with Derrida. In the interest of time, rather than take this paragraph on line by line, I will simply point out that Roland Barthes was the author of another well-known prior essay called The Death of the Author, which also argues against author-centered criticism, that is, criticism that focuses on authorial intent as a way of fixing or limiting the meanings of texts. Barthes comes from a slightly different theoretical direction than Derrida, but his goal is similar, to decenter the author as the ultimate arbiter of a text's meaning. Now, for anyone encountering these ideas for the first time, particularly if you are at all attracted to more romantic ideas about art as individual self-expression, these might sound like radical notions. But as it turns out, for Foucault, these familiar themes of contemporary writing, as he calls them, are not radical enough. Or, as he declares towards the end of the 7th paragraph, I am not certain that the consequences derived from the disappearance or death of the author have been fully explored, or that the importance of this event has been appreciated. And so, finally, 7 dense paragraphs into the essay, Foucault shows his hand. His goal, it seems, is not so much to correct himself, but to outdo both Barthes and Derrida by pursuing the implications of their ideas about the nature of the signifier and disappearance or death of the author still further. In the next video, we'll take a look at how he does this. and this time I'll be getting a bit of help from Batman.